Good evening. I am Gwydion Sullivan, Penn Faulkner's Executive Director, and I am so excited for tonight's conversation. Most of you probably already know Penn Faulkner, but in case some of you don't, we are a national literary organization that's best known for giving out the Penn Faulkner Award for fiction and the Penn Malamud Award for excellence in the short story. But we also run a variety of education programs that bring visiting authors and donated books and writing instruction into underserved classrooms in DC, all at no cost to the schools and the students to inspire the next generation of readers and writers. And of course, we hold public literary programs just like this one. Now, our literary programs are all about conversation and connection. And the last few minutes of tonight's event are for your questions. So please use the Q&A box at any time during the conversation you're about to hear if you want to join in on that dialogue. Now, tonight we are incredibly lucky to have not one, but two Penn Faulkner Award winners joining us. First, we have Garth Greenwell, the author of What Belongs to You, Cleanness, and this year's winner of the Penn Faulkner Award, Small Rain, which I cannot praise highly enough, though you probably already know that or you wouldn't be here. It is a masterful work of art. Garth is a widely published writer with work in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and Harper's, among other journals, and he's also a Guggenheim Fellow and a British Book Award winner. Second, speaking with Garth tonight will be Deesha Philyaw, whose debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, another book I absolutely treasure, won the 2021 Penn Faulkner Award, not to mention the Story Prize and the LA Times Book Prize. And her debut novel, The True Confessions of First Lady Freeman, is forthcoming from HarperCollins in 2026. And with that, take it away, Garth and Deesha.
Thank you so much, Gwydion. And Garth, I am honored to be here tonight to discuss Small Rain with you and some other things as well. But I want to start our conversation just by asking how you are. And like we did that a lot in the Zoom days, early days of the pandemic, and we got away from it. But now I feel like we need to start doing that again. So let's just check in first. It feels weird to just jump in conversation given everything happening. How are you?
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a fraught question, isn't it? And I feel like I'm on this weird dual track where on one hand, I'm terrible. Everything is awful. The world is on fire and everything is horrible. And then on the other hand, I'm home for the first time in a couple of years. I had been living in New York, and my partner and I had been living separately, and now we're together again. And that is a source of great joy and being in my little house in Iowa City. So I am weirdly dual tracked in how I am. How are you? How are you doing?
I I'm not at home. I have been on the road a lot. I was in Japan for 11 days. But as you said, it's a dual track. We're enjoying the things we can enjoy, like, travel and visiting places for the first time, as Japan was for me. But then, coming back to the US and things are worse than I left them. But then we have moments like tonight, and we have art, and we have our writing, and trying to, make the most of it. And I want to talk about that sort of being artist in this moment. That's one of my questions for tonight. But I want to start by just sort of grounding our conversation with a little summary of Small Rain. If there is anyone who joined us tonight who's not familiar with sort of the basic premise of the book, the Small Rain's unnamed narrator is a poet and a teacher. And this is the same character that we met in your debut novel, What Belongs to You, and your second novel, Cleanness. And those books, we found him in Bulgaria, but Small Rain finds him in Iowa, where he's now teaching at a university. And at the onset of the book, there's a mysterious, debilitating pain that forces him literally to his knees. And he goes first to the ER, then he's admitted to ICU. And this is all in those early months of the pandemic. And so that's all raging around him. And to kind of tee up my first question, I want to read a little excerpt from the end of the book that will provide a little greater context for my first question. And it's for folks reading along with the hardcover version. It's page 249 towards the top of the page. What a strange thing a body is, I thought. How eerie to be filled with blood and covered with hair, to be a machine, any part of which might fail. And how strange to have hated it so much when it had always been so serviceable, when it had done more or less everything I had needed until now, for more than 40 years it had worked so well. Poor body, I thought again, looking down on it. I had hated it so much and been so ashamed, and I might have loved it instead. I thought suddenly it had been all that time available for love, and it had never occurred to me to love it. It would have seemed impossible as it seemed impossible now. So many breathtaking moments in Small Rain, and that was one of my favorites. So how would you characterize this narrator's evolution from What Belongs to You to Small Rain? And I mean that broadly, but I'm also specifically interested in the evolution of his understanding of love, romantic love, and also his relationship to his body.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you for that, and thank you for the question. Um, I mean, certainly there has been a big evolution in love, and from What Belongs to You, which I actually think of all of my books as love stories. What Belongs to You is a very compromised love story. It's a love story that is mediated by money and sort of obstructed by class difference and difference in language difference and differences of all kinds. And then in Cleanness, there's a central section where the narrator experiences a different kind of love, but a love that is also kind of doomed from the start. And there's a way that the fact that he knows this relationship is going to have an ending allows him to open himself up to the possibility of that relationship.
Mm.
Small Rain is the first time, and I think the first time in the narrator's life where he finds himself in a relationship. And one way of thinking about a relationship is as a kind of um, story that you tell with another person. And it's a story that he doesn't really know the shape of, and a story that he doesn't know the ending of, a story that sort of, in some sense, is horizonless. And I think he finds that really bewildering. And I also think there's a way in which, this is a narrator who has been attached to an idea of his life as adventure. He's lived abroad, so geographical adventure, but also erotic adventuring. And most of his erotic life has been engaged with cruising and various kinds of um, sort of looser sexual socialities. And one of the big, oh, you can see my cat in the background.
Yeah.
Hey buddy, one of, I think, the big arcs across the book is, coming to understand that this story he's in the midst of writing with this beloved other person, that in some sense seems like the opposite of adventure. He's several years into a long-term partnership. He has a mortgage on a house in the American Midwest.
Domestic.
Very domestic, and yet that also is an adventure. That that is an experience that allows for the same sense of surprise and revelation that he has found in other forms of life.
And how do you feel that, excuse me, you have evolved as a writer between these three books, among these three
Yeah.
books?
I mean, I feel like the first two books I really did kind of trick myself into writing them. What Belongs to You, I had never written fiction before. I had never written prose. I had only ever written poetry. And both What Belongs to You and Cleanness have weird shapes, and they're written in pieces. And there was a way, certainly with What Belongs to You, I didn't realize I was writing a book until like the second to last scene of that book. That was the first time I was like, wait a minute, I think I've written a novel. I would have been paralyzed if I had sort of thought,
I'm
and
going to write a novel.
terrified, like who does that? And then with this book, for the first time, it was an experience where sitting down to write the first sentence, I thought, I am writing a book. And understanding that too as a kind of adventure for which I would not have been equipped writing my first two books. This sense of, okay, I'm going to be in this for years. And I mean, that was scary. You don't know when you embark on a project like that,
Yes.
you don't know what the journey is going to look like, what kind of adventure it's going to be.
Yeah, that uncertainty. Um, let's talk a bit more about fears. One of my greatest fears in the early months of the pandemic was that, I think this was true of a lot of us, my family members or I would end up in the hospital. I was just terrified of that. And so when I began reading Small Rain, the story just snatched me right back into that moment, into that time. And I felt that deep sense of dread and terror. And as I was reading, I feared for the narrator because he doesn't know what's happening. We don't know what's happening either. We're, right there with him. And so I'd like to, if you could talk about the various fears in Small Rain and how you portray them.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting question. He is sort of very afraid. I mean, he has that fear of the hospital. It's one reason why, as you said, he's sort of, the book begins with the narrator being struck down by this debilitating pain, and he waits 5 days to go to the hospital. And later he'll be told that, 5 days untreated, there's something like a 75% mortality rate, that he's
Yeah.
really lucky to be there, to be alive. And I think, that when he finally does go to the hospital, and one of the first things he's told by a surgeon in the ER is, you could die from this. And this is a guy who's basically always been healthy. He's in his early 40s. He hasn't been thinking about death, and suddenly death is there. And I think, and he realizes that he's really scared of it. And he's
Mhm.
also really scared of the pressure that that puts on his whole life and on the choices that he's made, and the way that this fact of mortality, which for the first few days in the hospital, it really does seem like everyone around him is thinking death is a real possibility. um, that puts pressure and makes him confront this question of, okay, if this is it, what has my life meant? What does it amount to? That's a terrifying thing to ask. And under that pressure, sort of all of the gambles one has made with one's life, the gamble of art, the gamble of love,
Mm.
all of that is put under pressure. And, I think the great fear he confronts is the fact that he has to discover now whether these structures, whether they're going to bear weight, that weight of mortality.
Mhm. And continuing with fear, I want to talk about it as both a motivator and an obstacle for writers in our processes and in our lives. And if you could speak about that in your own life and work, and if there's a way you encourage other writers or your students, because it can paralyze us.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that it's become weirdly hard to talk about, because talking honestly about what I think are the real dangers of art making
Hmm.
and the fear that one feels in response to those dangers, it sounds like one is harking back to a kind of passe model of the artist as romantic hero.
Hmm.
But when I think of the writers who have meant the most to me, like the poet Frank Bedard, for 60 years, Frank Bedard has been throwing himself into the abyss and making poems out of what he finds there. And I think any time, well, no absolute statement about art is ever true. I think, often when one is writing things that feel like they have a kind of ultimate meaningfulness.
Mhm.
Again, that's a kind of adventure or a kind of journey, and you don't know where it will take you. And it has certainly been true that writing all of my books and really writing the passages that to me seem truest, they are really scary passages. And sometimes it's surprising what passages they are. So there's a scene in Cleanness, which is part of this central love story, where the narrator starts kissing his boyfriend's body. And, it's this section that takes up several pages in the book of just him. That was a terrifying passage to write, sort of giving oneself over to that, you know, overwhelming kind of potentially sort of like an experience potentially losing yourself in that overwhelming feeling. And in this book there's a passage, it's the passage from which you read, where the narrator just describes his body, and it's this sort of very stark passage where he's being bathed by his nurse, and he
Mhm.
just looks at his body and sort of says what he sees. That was a terrifying passage to write. And, when I approach those passages, I've had the experience of, sort of, it's like you're, it's like you're at that moment of the roller coaster where it's like gravity, where like
Yes.
gravity is suspended. And you're
Yes.
sort of like, am I really going to do this? Because if I tip over, I've got to go with it. Like as far
Yes.
as it goes, I've got to go.
Mhm.
That's always scary. And I think, it's something that I talk about with my students, because I do think there's a kind of bravery and a willingness to risk being lost that is necessary for, as I say, the kind of art that I think means most to me, for that kind of art making.
Mhm. Thank you. Let's talk about obsessions since we're keeping it heavy. So,
Fair enough.
um, I think, as artists, as writers, we're often driven by our obsessions in our creative work, and we just keep following them, sometimes even subconsciously. And when I was preparing this question, because I want to know what your obsessions are, I was reminded of the headline that accompanied Parul Segal's review of Small Rain in the New Yorker. The headline was, "An anatomist of pleasure gives voice to the body in pain." So you are an anatomist, a master of the body, in Small Rain and in all of your novels. And so would you say that the body is one of your obsessions, and or are there other obsessions that fuel your creative work?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the body is my obsession, but also not just the body, but also and the body and extremity. I mean, I think sex is one kind of extremity, and
Mhm.
sickness is another kind of extremity. But also embodiedness, like the
Mhm.
experience of being a consciousness in a body, the
Mhm.
experience of being, something that feels like spirit, something that feels like it's not bound by place and time, but is in this material being that is absolutely situated in space and time and is mortal and fragile. And the sort of dilemma that places on us, the fact that I think to be a human animal,
Mhm.
is to be characterized maybe by three things, which is that, you know, we are the animal that knows that we will die.
Mhm.
We are the animal whose fulfillment comes in loving and in being loved. And we are the animal that needs, kind of as the sort of deepest necessity of our being, to make meaning. And that process of making meaning is, I think, finally like the deepest obsession of my work. And I think we turn to sex to make meaning, we turn to love to make meaning, I think we turn to God to make meaning, and I think we turn to art to make meaning. And all of those activities as meaning making activities are things that I sort of find myself coming back to again and again as a writer.
And that takes us nicely into my next question, which is what you said about why you wrote Small Rain. And I'm quoting you here, that you wrote it as a way of testing in the wake of a sudden and bewildering health crisis, my protagonist's faith in art as a source of durable meaning, of transcendence. And so, of course, now we are collectively, nationally, globally facing an endless stream of crises. And as artists, some of us are just unsure of what to do in the midst of it. What do you consider to be either the role of the artist in general in this moment, or even just for yourself specific in particular as an artist? What is our role in this moment?
You know, I truly believe that is a question that has to be asked individually by every artist, and that no one, not even another artist, can tell an artist what their role is. My own sense of it, again, we began this conversation talking about dual tracks, and very often with big questions, I find myself believing something and also its opposite. So on one hand, I find myself feeling a little bit of impatience when I see big claims being made for the role of art in moments of political crisis. And I think none of us should delude ourselves that in writing a sonnet, we have discharged our responsibilities as citizens. And I do think it's important that we acknowledge, one of a line that I find in my head again and again, or sort of just constantly, is a line from Shakespeare, one of Shakespeare's sonnets. How with this rage shall beauty hold a plea? The fact that, if you're in Kiev and bombs are falling on your city, um, there is a very real sense in which art is absolutely powerless.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think art is our greatest source of moral value. And there is no world, like it is art that makes any conceivable world not just bearable to me, but cherishable. Like any world we could want to fight for has to be a world that has, along with other things, art at its center.
Mm-hmm.
So, art is never more futile than when our government is kidnapping college students and putting judges in jail.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing is more crucial, not because art is going to fix that, but because art is the thing that makes any world we could want to live in worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm. So that dual track, I think that's our theme for tonight. It comes up as well in what you've said about sex writing.
Mm.
And I have quoted you endlessly in workshops and everywhere on this subject, because you get your work itself and then your public statements about sex writing, you give permission to writers who, for whatever reason, may be hesitant, who have, there's so many pitfalls in writing about sex, but also who have been told that, sex writing isn't serious writing, or it's not literary, or any of those other lies. And so thank you for giving us that permission. One of the things that I love that you say is that sex is a kind of crucible of humanness, and therefore a very powerful tool for a writer, that embodiment that you were talking about earlier. But you also say, this is the other track, that it's no different than writing about anything else, despite all of our consternation and hand-wringing over it. So, anatomists, tell us, what makes good sex writing, and what do you think gets in the way of good sex writing?
Well, I'm so moved that you said, thank you. I'm so moved that you have um, found things that I've said about it helpful. I do take this kind of embracing of paradox and contradiction and inconsistency because I really do believe, like, on one hand, I want to make these big claims for sex. Like, it gives us, again, it's one of our primary meaning making activities. It's, I think, the densest form of communication we have. So, of course, artists, despite the fact that there are voices in the culture that say it's unserious or it's not worthy of attention or it can't be done well.
Right.
As though this huge territory of human experience is like locked off to artists. I mean, that's
Right.
just crazy talk. So I want to claim that it allows us, that it's this crucible of humanness that allows, and then I also want to claim, as you say, it's no different from writing any aspect of human experience. And I think in terms of what gets in the way, I mean, there are all of those voices and all of those cultural lessons. And I think, especially if you're not straight, if you're not sort of writing into one of the dominant scripts of like what a meaningful life looks like in our culture, then I think you feel especially these voices that say, this doesn't matter, or you can't, by writing about this, by writing about, like in my first novel, two guys who meet in a bathroom,
Mhm.
you can't reach the heart of human experience. You can't speak to something larger than this particular, seemingly fringe activity. I mean, you have to, I think, you know, in response to that, I think one has to tell oneself the stories that one always has to tell oneself when one writes, which are, this does matter. I will reach something, and also, and I tell this especially to sort of young queer writers, that we have to tell ourselves what is a lie, and we need to know that it's a lie because there are all sorts of structural reasons why certain voices are heard and certain voices are less likely to be heard. But we still have to tell ourselves the lie, and we have to believe it, that if we make it, if we write it fiercely enough and beautifully enough and truly enough, it will be unignorable. And we don't go to some mainstream reader. We don't try to sort of translate the value of queer lives so that they're immediately legible by mainstream. Instead, we say, if we do our job, we will be unignorable and they will come to us. And that's a lie, and we know it's a lie, but also it's a necessary lie, and we have to believe it. And then what, the sort of technical challenges, I do think almost always, 99% of the time, if sex writing is failing on the page, it's failing for the same reasons that any other kind of writing fails on the page, which is you're not being true to the experience, you're not being specific, you're describing an idea of sex, not actual bodies in space, you're using borrowed language, all of those things that just, it's the job of a writer at every stage to constantly be fighting against all of those temptations that are ways of avoiding reality. And what makes good sex writing is the same as what makes good writing of any other kind, which is having that bravery, that fortitude, that endurance to face up to reality.
So I'm looking at our time, and I have so many more questions for you, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question that one of my students gave me to ask you, one of my former students. Um, She says, music holds a significant presence in Small Rain, and I'm wondering if you could speak to the role it plays within the narrative, how it functions as a bridge between your characters, and how it informs the thematic structure of the novel and your broader creative process as a writer. Go.
Well, it's true for me that music was my first education in art. And, I grew up in the pre-internet American South. I come from a family of tobacco farmers. I was first generation raised off the farm. I did not grow up in a cultural household. And, it was a choir director in my public school who gave me my first tapes of opera
Mhm.
and sort of introduced me to this entirely different way of being in the world, which was opera. And it was music that allowed me an escape from a world in which I felt I had no place. And everything I am as a writer, I think I owe to my musical education. And in the novel, there's a really crucial scene early on where, a hospital is a huge bureaucratic space, and very often the narrator feels like he's being processed in various ways, and he's, in some ways his humanity, his personhood is being stripped away from him, and he's, just being treated like a machine. And on one hand, you know, if a surgeon treating me like a machine allows her to save my life,
Right.
treat me like a machine. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, when you're in the ICU at the height of the pandemic, and that means that he can only see his partner for like an hour a day, he's just hugely isolated. Having moments where he feels like he's a human being interacting as a human being with other human beings become really important. And art, at several points in the book, and the first instance it involves music, becomes a moment where the roles of, like, say, nurse and patient, um, something escapes them. And
Mm-hmm.
art provides a way for this kind of human contact across bureaucracy and across, these incredibly exhausted, overworked, heroic healthcare providers. Music is something that allows, despite that exhaustion, a sort of human contact between people.
So I'm going to sneak in one more question for me, and then we'll open up to the questions that have been submitted to the Q&A box. I am so curious about your revision process. And, do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you revise as you go? Do you bang out one big draft and then go back?
Yeah, I try really hard not to revise as I go.
Okay.
I try, and I always tell my students, although nobody knows how to write a novel and nobody can tell you how to write a novel and you figure it out. I always encourage my students, who I feel sometimes, like sometimes in workshop, they submit the same chapter again and again, sort of in
Yeah.
different versions. I feel like that's a trap. I feel like you can't know what chapter one needs to do until you figure out what book you're writing. And you do
Yes.
that by writing to the end of the draft. So I am a big fan of, I write by hand, I write in notebooks. I try to write messily, so it's hard for me to go back and read what I've written. And I try to get all the way to the end
Mm-hmm.
before I then start thinking about, okay, what's going on? What is the book? What's the territory of the book? And then, my MO, I write slowly. I tend to write about 30% more than should actually be there. And I try to do that. My, like, mantra to myself is be indulgent. Like, just,
Yeah.
sort of any impulse, follow it, because you don't know, even if you think, oh, this is a dead end, these pages are terrible, you don't know where they're going to lead. You don't
Right.
know. And I find cutting a lot easier and condensing a lot easier than realizing that, oh, I sort of missed a huge
Yes.
narrative beat that now I have to go figure out how to. So my revision process is a lot of stripping back and sort of putting pressure and trying to figure out, what can go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's, if I don't give myself permission to overwrite, if I don't give myself permission to be indulgent, I just won't find what's there. That's sort of my discovery device, I guess.
And what a gift, what a gift, because there's so much self-editing that happens if we're not careful. So thank you for all of your generous answers tonight and to my indulgent questions. So let's see what we have waiting for us in the Q&A box. Garth, you mentioned Frank, is it Bedard?
Yeah.
As a poet you admire. Who are some of your favorite poets?
Oh, I mean, poetry was really it for me. And when I think, especially in US literature, English language literature, certainly US literature and recent US literature, they're all poets. My for prose, when I think of the sort of prose writers who have been most important to me, I really do look to Europe and look to writers, some of whom I first experienced in translation, like Bernhard or Javier Marias. In English, you know, recent poets, they are people like, well, my teachers, Frank Bedart, Carl Phillips, Jory Graham, Louise Glick was a really important writer for me. Carolyn Forche was an important writer. Also a group of writers, the first poets I fell in love with, and I fell in love with them by picking their books up randomly at Holly Cook booksellers in Louisville, Kentucky. And they were people like Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez and Adrienne Rich. Like those were the people who first got me excited about language. And reading poetry is still, and memorizing poetry is still a part of like my daily practice. And it's also a part, every time I teach workshop, every class, we read a poem together. And I taught a craft seminar on Henry James um, the last semester I taught at NYU. And alongside Henry James, we read Carl Phillips, who I think is a very Jamesian writer, to sort of see how the technology, the sort of Jamesian technology of the sentence that James invented, how that is, inherited and transformed by a writer like Carl Phillips. So those are Henri Cole is another poet I really love. Those are some of my touchstones.
Okay. Let's see, this question is for both of us. What are some of our favorite examples of books or stories that have good sex writing?
Ooh, take it. You
Oh
start.
gosh. Oh, I'm gonna go with Toni Morrison. I think she's really slept on in terms of sex writing, but I think it depends on, how we define it. It doesn't always have to be super erotic. But one of the sexiest things is, and I want to say, is this in not Song of Solomon, maybe it's in Love. Oh, anyway, the quote is, "She was the third beer." Right?
Wow.
So, so maybe I just nerd out about sex writing. It doesn't always have to be, but talk about embodiment, right? We know exactly what that means. I mean, she goes on to break it down, but, describing a woman as a beer, she's not the first beer, so that tells us a lot there. And even in where the sex is very complicated in Beloved, and how she uses sex in that novel, in that very, horrific context around slavery. But it requires that bravery that you have been talking about all evening. And then, of course, I think Sula, which is my favorite Morrison novel, is super sexy because of all of the transgressive sex, that happens in Sula. So those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, those are great. I love, there are passages from Beloved that I love teaching when I teach sex writing because I think they show how sex can be a vehicle for addressing the largest questions about history, about trauma. Yeah, I agree. I think Toni Morrison is really masterful. And I also agree that, I like an expansive sense of what sex writing is. So, one of my favorite passages of sex writing is in Colette La Vagabonde, which I teach in my sex writing class, even though there's no sex in it. But there is a description of a kiss that is the sexiest thing imaginable. That's an incredible book for sex writing. Um, and then also thinking about, I write a lot about people I admire for their sex writing. I have an ongoing series on my Substack where I write about great sex writing. I just wrote about a fantastic passage in Patrick Nathan's most recent novel. Um, but there is a book by a writer I really admire and I feel like is really underread named Barbara Browning. And she has a book called The Gift. And one of the things that happens in The Gift is just this radical reimagining of what sex can be.
Mhm.
And, she talks about sex as being sort of any choreographed shared movement of the body. And a lot of that book is about a very sexy relationship that happens online with someone she exchanges YouTube videos with. She talks about knitting as a kind of erotic contact because she imagines, you know, the recipient wearing this gift she's making. I love that book. Actually, when I teach a semester-long sex writing class, I end with that book because I think it just sort of explodes our minds about what sex writing could be, what it could encompass.
Absolutely. Um, let's see. Earlier, you talked about this idea of borrowed language, and someone's asking if you could expand on that.
Yeah, you know, I think it's really hard. I mean, obviously, all language is borrowed language. You know, language is a system that pre-exists us. We learn to speak by using the words other people give to us. Um, you know, nothing in language is exactly original. Language is a system that uses me as much as I use it. All of those things. And it is very hard, and this is connected with that idea, you know, very often, again, in sex writing, I think you're not actually writing this, you're writing an idea of it. Not just sex writing, also somebody eating a muffin. You're not
Right,
writing somebody eating a muffin. You're writing an idea of somebody eating a muffin.
right.
You're writing, you know, a TV, you know, a representation you saw of sex or of someone eating a muffin. You are not writing the actual experience. And that, you know, again, this gets back to the idea of embodiedness, you know, doing the imaginative work of putting yourself in that finite embodied existence, that particular space, that particular moment that your character is inhabiting, in order to access not an idea about the thing, but the thing itself. You know, again, that's a challenge, and that's not something you learn and like you've got it. I mean, that's for me the challenge every day sitting down is how am I going to write something that is true and not just something I've heard or seen reported.
Mhm. Someone's asking the book that you referenced by Colette, what was the title?
Oh, so The Vagabond, La Vagabonde. It's often kept in the French, but The Vagabond. Just a miraculous novel and incredibly sexy. And, you know, it's a novel, it's sort of ravishingly romantic, but it's also a novel about a woman choosing herself and choosing her art over a certain kind of romantic narrative. I think it's just an extraordinary novel.
We only have time for one more question. Garth, what are some of your favorite operas that you've seen or listened to, and how does appreciating opera relate to your writing?
Oh, I love this question. I mean, it's everything. You know, again, I think everything I know about narrative, I learned from opera. And actually, I can be even more specific. I learned from the chamber operas of Benjamin Britten, which have been an obsession of mine
Mm.
since I was a kid. You know, I think this obsession comes from the fact that I just immediately, well, the second opera I ever saw was Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw, which is an adaptation of the Henry James novel. I didn't know Henry James then. I didn't know anything about opera then, but like my entire DNA as an artist was sort of that experience at the Kentucky Opera when I was 14 years old. This choir director at my public high school gave me tickets. Like that, my whole life as an artist comes from that moment. And the
Mm.
way that those chamber operas, you know, Britain gets a kind of maximal effect from minimal means. That's something I'm
Mm.
very drawn to. I think is also true in a way of Henry James. And the way that, you know, that music moves from sort of point of emotional heat to point of emotional heat. You know, narrative in opera is less important than a kind, and certainly narrative logic. I mean, often in opera, there's just no narrative logic, but there's an emotional logic.
Emotional,
And,
right?
you know, that's what plot is to me. It's getting from one emotional moment to another emotional moment.
I love ending on that note. Gwydion, can you please rejoin us now? Garth, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you. And there's lots of praise in the chat for the conversation and for you and for your work.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank you both. That was a really rich and really thoughtful and really connected conversation. We're just so lucky to have you both as Penn Faulkner Award-winning authors. You have absolutely, without a doubt, enriched the legacy of our award with your artistry. So thank you. Um, for those of you who in the audience who are here with us in the DC area, and if you want to spend more time with these two, which I can't imagine why you wouldn't, I really hope you'll consider joining us for the Penn Faulkner Award celebration on May 15th at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. Single tickets are still on sale. They're actually really close to selling out, so get in while the getting is good. And I believe we've got a link dropped into the chat. It's going to be a spectacular evening, star-studded, honoring all of this year's finalists, including Garth and Percival Everett, Danzy Senna, Susan Wadi-Daraj, and Pemi Aguda, with testimonials from all three of our judges, Deesha and Luis Alberto Urrea and Bruce Holsinger. Plus, we will also be honoring our Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, with a special tribute by the amazing Jason Reynolds. So you really don't want to miss out. That is the place to be, May 15th, if you are a literary person in DC. Finally, I also want to remind everyone here that Penn Faulkner is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to champion the breadth and power of fiction in America, like all the work we talked about here tonight. And we can't complete that mission without help. And every single small contribution, really small, makes a difference. Even literally $15 helps us buy and donate a novel to one of the thousands of students that we work with in the DC school system through our education programs. And in many cases, really listen to this, in many cases, the novel we give them is the first book that student owns. Can you imagine that? So I think we've got another link dropping into the chat. And I hope you'll consider making sure that everyone everywhere, even those who can't afford it, has access to the kind of rich cultural experience that we all just had tonight. And so with that, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you all for being here. And I wish you a good night.